Hi, folks. Good morning, good evening.
Hey, Jonas.
Hey, Jonas.
Hi, everyone. Since now it's 9:05 and we already have 19 people here, so I think we can get started. Thanks for taking the time to joining this Iceberg Catalog Community Think. This is a meeting that we discuss any topics related to the catalog. So the first topic on the list today is the interoperable fine-grained access endpoint discussions. And I think Robert bring this up. Robert, do you want to take over from here? Robert, I think you're muted.
Damn technology. Sorry.
So yeah, I've sent out an email on the dev mailing list, um, proposing an REST endpoint for the interoperable FGAG high-level discussion. So basically a follow-up of that. And the proposal for the REST endpoint is to give query engines the protection instructions, like the row filter, the current confirmation that it needs. Authorization aspects, all of them are kind of orthogonal to that proposal. And that means that how an actual catalog implements authorization is completely up to the implementation. One technical approach to implement these is to use OR delegations. So like query engine X acts on behalf of a user Y. So users may actually ask for protection rules or policies that contain things like string concatenations, calculations, basically leveraging the whole spiel of all these SQL functions, case coalesce, typecasting exceptions. Some examples could be like, for example, a credit card number masking where you do a substring, extracting the last four digits, for example, and prefix that with 4 stars or something. Other examples could be that you say you have a column that's called country, and you want to ensure that only people in a specific country see only contents for that country. So say you could say country equals DE for Germany, or country in DE FR for France, Italy, Spain, whatever. Or you could assume that the country column has been maybe populated with all the various representations how a country name could be made. So it could be DE, it could be uppercase DE, lowercase, it could be DEU if it's a 3-letter combination. So that would require kind of a case normalization and inquiries as the predicate. We've been looking into how Iceberg expressions could help with that, but it seems like it's not yet there to fulfill, for example, these more complex functionalities like basic SQL functions, typecasting, case expressions, or returning the anything else than a Boolean. So what we did in the proposal is to propose that catalogs have to implement Iceberg expressions, and they should implement SQL as a form of to represent these protection instructions to make these current use cases work. If Iceberg expressions fulfill what the user has been asking for in the policy, then the catalog can obviously return the representation using Iceberg expressions. What we also can, I would basically stop here and maybe open the floor for questions or concerns or comments, any form.
No one else?
Go ahead, Ryan.
I'm pretty opposed to putting SQL here. I think that we can express everything that we need to with a combination of Iceberg expressions and SQL UDFs, and that SQL UDFs are ultimately a better mechanism for multi-dialect, multi-representation exchange of these primitives. So I think that the immediate goal with this is to use expressions like Iceberg expressions, and also to follow up and get the SQL UDF stuff done. So I would not support moving forward with this with SQL in the proposal.
What do you think of having the ability to support alternative representations?
I think that the appropriate place for that is in SQL UDFs, where we have multiple representations and also multiple dialects.
Yeah, I mean, one thing of the initial proposal was to say the catalog can prevent exposing internals, say all the roles that the user is assigned to, the username, maybe something like, hey, my IDP knows which IP address I'm coming from. I mean, that goes back internally to a functionality that transforms these policies or rules or expressions down and constant folds them so that the query engine effectively just get the constant folded expression, eliminating all these say security sensitive details.
I don't know I don't understand how that connects to whether the catalog will supply SQL fragments to clients. The problem with supplying SQL fragments to clients is that all clients are not all clients are SQL engines. Not all clients can parse SQL. And it's actually very confusing because the SQL fragments can and probably do have 3-value Boolean logic and other, very painful things. If you're if you're coming from like a Rust world or something like that. So I think that Iceberg expressions being very well defined and working around cases where you have 3-value Boolean logic is probably the right way to go with SQL UDFs, along with their ability to incorporate different representations and dialects as the fallback for making this more expressive.
I mean, Dimitri?
You're muted.
Oh, too bad. I spoke so much already. So yeah, I just wanted to add some context to what Robert is saying, maybe for a better understanding. Essentially, the problem is like this. So suppose a user wants to make a decision, an FGAC decision based on the query user's membership in certain roles, right? Or maybe just based on the name of the user, right? How would this be expressed in UDFs? I wonder. What's your vision, Ryan?
I'm sorry.
I was saying that
catalog
sorry. I was saying that a common use case is for the administrator to set up an FGAC rule that is based on the user's membership in certain roles, or maybe on the user's identity. How would this be expressed in UDFs, in your opinion?
So that would probably be something that's not expressed in a UDF. That could be something that is expressed as simply a function of the user's identity in a regular Iceberg expression. I'm saying the expressibility of needing to like join to another table and do some of these very complex SQL things is what you would extend that filter language with using UDFs.
I would actually just add to that, like there's two different approaches, and it depends on what kind of rules they're applying, because SQL UDF could still be something like current user, like a lot of databases have. So if it's built into the logic of that, and you're joining against current user, or doing some sort of thing there, you can express that with the SQL UDF. But you can still also return different expressions or filters based on the actual principal that's coming in. I think that having that flexible based on the catalog being able to rewrite, based on, who is requesting or other information, which filters or kind of FGAC rules get applied, I think everybody expects that would be the case too.
I'm still not sure, because we kind of discussing this in the very abstract sense. In the practical sense, do you mean something like an expression which would read as username equals Bob?
Well, so why don't you tell us what the filter is you're trying to achieve, and we can work through that example.
Right. So the main point behind this proposal is to be able to remove all users' details on the server side, so that the protection instructions sent to the engine do not have any information about the user's identity as the server perceives it.
Understood. And what is the row level policy that you're targeting?
So basically, say if the policy says allow user with allow entry like a row with say I don't know, key of New York, to do not allow to use a Bob. User Bob is evaluated on the server side, and the protection instruction says if city equals New York, if the protection instruction would be city equals New York and false, something like that, right? Or city not equals New York. So that context is evaluated on the server side. The engine just gets the expression tailored to that particular user.
So the expression is something like case when user in list of names, then further filter at that point. We can take that expression and simplify it to basically region not equal to New York. Then that's what the service sends back. So yes, there is still work being done on to interpret these filters, but having the filters in a form that is not a SQL fragment actually enables the service to simplify those filters and work with them, rather than needing to basically understand every SQL dialect out there.
Yeah, that is fine, but where do UDFs come in? I'm not sure.
UDFs come in the expressibility. So I think that the argument for SQL is that there are some things that Iceberg filters don't express today, right? So things like, take the user and look up the user in the regions table, or user regions table, and get the user's region, and then filter to just the rows in that region. So I live in the US, I would join to the regions table and get my US region, and then I would filter down to just that region. That sort of join can be done in a couple ways. First of all, if you know the user's region, you could do what you're suggesting and just take that region, embed it into the filter that you send back to the client, and you have now where region equals US. The alternative here is, if you wanted to express that as a join, you could use the UDF, use a UDF to express that SQL fragment that pulls up the user's region, where region equals user region of current user, say. That user region would be a SQL UDF defined in the catalog, and that all gets shipped to the client. That is where you would do the lookup and things like that. But I don't think that we actually need a SQL fragment to achieve this. I think UDFs provide us the extensibility of the full range of things that SQL can do, while also bringing in a more predictable way of managing those SQL dialects, representations, and logic. I've talked for a long time.
Yeah. It's an interesting use case. I don't think it was envisioned as the primary FGAG approach, to be honest. I mean, Robert,
exactly.
can correct me if I'm misinterpreting something.
I think that that's exactly the point, that this is an extension for things that cannot be built outside of Iceberg expressions that require the full expressibility of SQL. We don't want to use this all the time, and a lot of things can use the server side injection of values like current user or user region. And then, only in narrow cases where you need more complexity do you fall back to SQL UDFs.
Okay, let's yeah, thanks for responding. Let's give other users a chance. I think Lauren is next in queue.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my question is about Iceberg expression because we talked a lot about that. Like Ryan, you mentioned like it's well defined, but actually I was looking for the specification and I didn't find any document. Like for me, like the specification is basically the code. And my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm really new, I guess, like assuming the code, that part of the code, is that Iceberg expression right now are really filter oriented or predicate oriented. So for column masking, for example, when you are looking more for like a function to transform the data, they are not really like suitable as it is today. And they do not support also mentioning external function, or at least they haven't been integrated yet with UDF. So is my understanding correct? And like, is there something to be done here actually to make it like a true spec and supporting like these extensions we are discussing?
I mean, we could certainly improve documentation. The spec that I would point you to is the REST specification. Yeah, exactly. In OpenAPI, we've defined what these things look like. Now we may need to clean some of that up. Admittedly, I don't remember putting in that you cannot have a null literal, in these things. So there may be some things that we can clean. But I would say, take a look at that as the specification. As far as extending that, we may need additional transforms. So we do have expressions that transform terms. For column expressions, you want to have some transform that's basically apply mask or something like that. We don't currently have definitions of those transformations, but I imagine we would need a handful of things to extend the Iceberg expression library rather than wholesale replace it with a chunk of SQL. So I think this is more about the direction that we choose to go with this API, and should it be an opaque string, or should it be a parsable expression that you can have a representation of in memory and exchange? And I would say the latter is what we want, because that is something that you can implement from any client, not just a client that understands SQL fragments.
But am I correct? Am I correct also to understand that like transformation and expression are two different things? They are not linked today.
So expressions can have terms that are transformed. Like it's a fairly limited thing right now, where we have all of the filters that Iceberg can run defined, and you can exchange those. Then the essentially left-hand side of any of those is a transform, or can be a transform expression. And we would probably just reuse that, where you have a function application that creates some derived value. We do have transforms in the library, so I guess to the extent that we need to extend that, I think that is going to be the easiest and best path.
Yeah, it just like checking like Russell, like it seems like an expression is always a Boolean. So like right now, like the model of an expression is really like predicate oriented. Okay, thanks.
Prashant?
Russell, you next, I think. Oh, Prashant, sorry.
Yeah. So I just wanted to highlight the advantages of expressions, just like from the perspective of constant folding as well. For example, if you have a predicate which says like the current user should be is equals to Prashant, then you can just constant fold it to true or false in your literal, and you can even Boolean simplify it in case you want, because Iceberg SDK has very good functionalities for it. For server-side resolution specifically, I mean, I was also pursuing the route for SQL to do the server-side resolution, but eventually landed up in the Iceberg expressions world to do the server-side resolution. If you want to check how to implement or what portability we have for the Iceberg expressions. I have like two context functions defined here, current principal and current principal role in the PR that I shared in Polaris, and how easily we can use just the Iceberg SDK functions to evaluate them, constant fold them, replace them in line with using the visitors with expressions that we have. So that certainly makes sense. And just wanted to allude to the point of why we need UDFs, especially for mapping tables and for things like, exists kind of a query, I think, Rand, that the same part of it, because exist is, because we can't model that. I mean, one of the chain of thoughts is, hey, can I materialize the exists query to be rewritten into a in predicate by running something in the catalog side? But again, it requires compute in the catalog and to understand what the thing is trying to do. And UDF hits the sweet spot to have that complexity in line. And the way, at least I can speak of, it's integrated in Spark. It provides a better way to inject into the planner itself in whatever dialect we agree with eventually. So just wanted to say +1 on that, and additionally call out the benefits if we go into the server-side resolution as an idea, and a reference implementation if one wants to look into that, how it can be achieved.
I don't know if it's my turn. I think
It is.
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to bring up, I don't know if we've gone over this a little bit, but the current scan planning API that we already have in the REST spec takes in expressions as its predicate filter. And I think it'd be a mistake if we were able to return something that the client would then have to parse, transform, and then send back to that API after they had made it into Iceberg expressions, because it feels like we'd have a little bit of a divergent API there. So that's another reason why I think we should do our best to make sure that Iceberg expressions is our interchange here. Just my thoughts on that.
That's an interesting point. I actually wanted to comment on like the endpoint. I'm a little concerned about introducing an extra endpoint for this. My preference would actually be that we would return this information with the load table request, because there's a lack of clarity around like, hey, when you actually load a table, when do I need to go hit this endpoint? When do I not need to hit this endpoint? And all of the relevant information you need at load time as well. So I think my preference would be sidecar this information. Some of the concerns that have been brought up in the past is around like, well, if I load a table, is that purely contextual to who's loading it, or can I trust the information for subsequent loads for caching purposes or other reasons? I think getting into the details of like figuring out what do we consider like static information about the table that you can rely on versus like user-specific content, and including this information in that response eliminates the need for like multiple requests, and also still provides the ability for people to kind of leverage information about the table as a constant.
The one thing I worry about there is if we want to use, because we're currently trying to use e-tags for like freshness in load table response. So you may say the table hasn't changed, but the policy has changed. And maybe you shouldn't have to, I don't know.
If I may reply to you both, like if the original proposal, like we posted with Robert, was actually like to add that information directly in the load table. The reason why we proposed the separate endpoint was more like as a way like to prototype, to see the integrations, and to be able to prototype quickly on Polaris side before like committing to the implementation in the load table. If people think like we can go and go directly into the load table change, I'm all for it, like, to be honest. But like I agree with you that like I would want also like to avoid multiple round trips. Now on the impact situations, I think what it means is that we should probably clarify the spec that like if the catalog is returning things which are technically information will change with like depending on the identity of things, and like you could argue that credential vending is probably like a much bigger issue than the policies. Technically, the e-tag should be saying like should be dependent on the user identity, and we should add a vary field in the header to say like, oh, by the way, like the bearer token or whatever authorization token you are using is something which may change the representation of the metadata, so that like the technically a client know like how to construct the caching key. Like if you were to follow truly like the ETAG spec. So that's my 2 answers for you guys.
Yeah, I think I would generally agree with that. We could either define ETAG as being just the content portion of the response, but like I think the right way to do it,
you probably need to introduce new headers, which are specifically to say, oh, that's just for the metadata and not depend on the HTTP ETAG spec, so that like there's no confusion about like exactly what's being cached or not cached.
Yeah, I agree. I think the best solution would be ETAG represents everything about the load response, right? Dimitri, let's see who's next. Talat.
This is I'm trying to understand, the more, because the plan endpoint I'm aware of maybe since last month I wasn't aware of that. And can we apply those policies, like we are talking about fine-grained access, but do you guys think that can we apply those policies on the planning phase? Then the engine will not know what happens. We can return the files which it's available for that engine.
Yeah, I think to Russell's point, like if I understand what you're asking correctly, Russell's point was, hey, well, if in scan plan, like we need to send an expression and we get an expression on load table, I think there's kind of a question of like, well, shouldn't the catalog just apply that when you do the scan plan as opposed to like relying on the client to go and like send that back? It is also a trusted client at this point because that's largely the context in which we're operating. So maybe if you want to be completely stateless, like you could build it that way, but I don't know. I would agree. It probably seems like you could just do it on the server side.
I'm going to hop in here and say that we're not talking about really scan planning and how that interacts. We're primarily concerned with trusted clients that are, planning a job themselves. So yes, you would probably incorporate this in scan planning as well. Right? Like you'd probably just and that in automatically for scan planning, but still when you communicate to the client, assuming that the client is going to plan its own scan, you do need to send that information.
I see. But still, I can apply the policies right on the scan planning, but the trusted client can just read the files.
I think this will require materialization, especially for column mask, right? Which is not necessarily every engine wanted to do, every server side, because it's quite heavy for server to materialize all things.
Prashant.
I wasn't thinking about it from a security perspective, but from an optimization perspective. If these expressions are used in plan scanning to reduce the number of files you touch, you want to be able to send them to the scan planning API as you got them.
But that would happen after the logical planning happened, which would then already have all the necessary information.
Let's not focus too much on sending these back in. I think Russell's point stands, which is, say you're a dumb client that is delegating as much as possible to the service. Having the service interact with you in 2 different ways is bad. And, even if you are doing all of the scan planning locally, requiring a SQL parser in the REST client in order to interpret responses from the service seems like a non-starter to me.
I think the better argument overall is just consistency of representation. Like we have expressions showing up in a number of other places, like potentially in default values and, if we introduce check constraints and all sorts of places, if we have this that we're reusing in a lot of different constructs and we need this flexibility in those other areas, going and inserting a SQL blob someplace as part of the protocol is probably not a great idea. Prashant.
Yeah. One thing wanted to check is the load table endpoint, if it returns the projections to apply, which can be transforms, and the filters to apply, which can be expressions. Now this whole workflow can only happen when the user is coming via a trusted engine. Otherwise, we would leak security predicates as part of load table. But at this point of time, so just wanted to know that, I mean, the same is true for credential vending too. Like, for example, I can't vend credentials if I don't know if the user is using a reliable engine, which will do the right thing to enforce. So one part is like, what happens to the untrusted world where I can't give credentials, I can't give projection policy back. Are we gonna say that, hey, for them, there is only a load table response, but without credentials and without projection policies, but there still will be a load table policy, or will we say that there will be no load table for you for non-trusted nodes?
I don't think we need to define that.
Exactly.
So from a security perspective, like the implementing catalog can make those decisions about what it wants to expose, what it doesn't want to expose, what it requires in order to expose, and like what a trusted partner actually is. So we don't want to get into specifying those things. And there are all sorts of mechanics, depending on which kind of security or authorization model you want to use to make that happen. So I think it is like making sure that it's optional. Like obviously we wouldn't make it required or anything like that, but providing the flexibility, but then letting the implementation decide how to do it.
Makes sense.
Me too.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back on multiple representations. I sense that the perception that all clients will have to implement SQL expressions. I don't think it's the case that specification proposes. The proposal is for clients to opt in to SQL representations if they want. Right? Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page here.
I don't think that I agree with that. So if you're saying, hey, the only way for you as a secure or trusted client to access this data is to include a SQL parser, that's not great. When we have the option of allowing people to build secure or trusted clients that don't require a SQL parser. So like, yes, it is technically an opt-in, but the effect is you're narrowing the space of things that will implement this part of the protocol. And I don't think that we should do that. And I don't think that we need to.
Also, the UDFs don't necessitate SQL. Like, I think that's the direction that we're going with the implementation right now, but it is still extendable to support like Python UDFs or things like that. I think the current state is we're not focusing on trying to solve everything at once. And the UDF representation with SQL is probably the easiest thing to get at least the definition in place and start using it. And then there's a question of like, is that enough, or do we need to extend to other representations, just like we did with the view representation?
So would you rather this spec didn't have multiple representations in principle and only had expressions, or would you prefer to have expressions as the first representation now and keep the door open for alternatives later?
I would not leave the door open to alternatives because I think we have a defined way of injecting alternative representations through UDF calls. So I would be in favor of only defining Iceberg expressions here.
So the feasibility of AVGAG implementation then becomes dependent on extending Iceberg expressions to cover more advanced cases like transformations, and maybe we need to evaluate the expressibility for filters as well. Would you agree to that?
I mean, you could definitely go do that work. I think that we would probably want to define a few mask or filter expressions that are expected to be there for common cases. Right now our transforms are largely just partition transforms. And I don't know that that's a sufficient set of things. I think in terms of filters, that space is like a lot more well-known. We exchange these filters with numerous engines already. And I think that we know the next step is to introduce a UDF type expression to extend that, but otherwise we're largely fine. So if you want to go do some analysis and say like, hey, this sort of thing should be supported by Iceberg expressions, but is not, I think that that's a great thing to do. Right now, I'm not convinced that it's where we should be putting effort, but you know, that's my opinion, and not really. That shouldn't direct where you choose to spend your time.
Any more comments on this? If not, I think we, for the time being, we can move to the next topic. And we keep the discussion continue on the dev main list, or if needed, we can make a separate sync meeting for this. Yeah. So the next topic on the list is the Dremel Auth Manager donation breakdown. Alex, do you want to provide more information on that?
Yep. So, hey, everybody. So I sent this email a while ago to the mailing list to propose to donate Dremel Auth Manager. The discussion stalled a bit on the objection that the code to donate was huge, and I think everybody agrees with that. And so I was asked to split the donation in multiple parts. So these days I did a POC just to make sure that it was possible in the first place. And yes, I managed to do that. So I wrote this document that I linked in the agenda with a proposal of different pull requests that we could open against the Iceberg repo. There are two main sections. There are the essential components. So basically all these must go in at some point. They can go in step by step, of course, but you can't really like stop in the middle. You wouldn't have a fully working auth manager. And then there are the optional pull requests, and these ones are actually the most interesting ones because these are features that we do not have currently in Iceberg. So, for example, authorization code or device code. Tarek, go ahead.
No, please continue. I just want to keep my.
You want to be the first one in the line.
Yes. But I don't want to hijack the discussion. That's why I will raise my hand again.
Sure. So that's basically it. I don't know. I already have my POC. So if you guys want to have a look at that, I can also put the link somewhere. It's in my private fork. Of course, it's just a POC for now. But yeah, that's basically it. Any other questions?
I'll let Tala go first because he actually had his hand up first.
Sorry for that. I know the library. I also test it partially, not completely. To be honest, as a user, I am not committer or PMC, but basically as a user, it's definitely useful. I just want to ask one question. Why we are trying to merge this kind of library in Iceberg, at least in my perspective, this is not Iceberg business. Can we introduce an Apache project which can a library, then Iceberg can, use that library directly, such as Polaris, right? The Polaris is the similar behavior. This is just a question.
I think this is definitely possible. It's certainly a community decision. One thing that I would say, though, is that if you keep it in Iceberg repo, the main Iceberg repo, it's very easy to then include the auth manager in the Spark and Flink runtimes. It's just a matter of adding a dependency and it would be included. And so it would be very convenient for users because they wouldn't need to add another jar when they launch Spark or Flink.
But this case also Iceberg will include that other project, right? The user doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's a matter of adding a jar line to your Spark invocation, but yeah.
Thank you.
So I think I'm next in line. Yeah, I am. So I had two kind of high level comments. The first one overlaps a little bit with what Talat was saying is that, the question of like, is this the right amount of complexity that we want to take on for something like the auth manager within the Iceberg project? And this is the area that I'm particularly sensitive to, just because it's like, there's a lot of security stuff here. There's a lot of code. And, it's an implementation of an RFC that sits out there. And I'm just wondering if there isn't a better approach, similar to some of the other auth managers that we've seen, like, the GCS one or the GCP one that we saw. Like, that's a very simple implementation that relies heavily on an external, set of libraries. And there are other ones out there, other implementations. I know Google has a generalized one. I don't know if that's the one we're actually using for the GCP one, or if it's different. There's also like Nimbus and a few other projects that support this. So the question from an implementation standpoint is it right for us to be rebuilding this? That puts a lot of like security onus and other things on us as a project, to make sure that we maintain and we keep up to date and address like security issues and things. But the as far as the donation is concerned, like, I think we probably need to step back and figure out, well, what do we actually want to support, which has not really been addressed. Like, we've talked a little bit about, like, the basics that we put in originally, and then, hey, let's standardize and have a more complete implementation. But we haven't really talked through, from an OAuth perspective, what are the flows that we actually want to support? What are the capabilities we want to support? So I think we've kind of shifted our focus too quickly to, hey, how do we get this in, as opposed to actually what do we want to support as the project?
Okay, so I'll start with the second objection. So yeah, that's the purpose of breaking down. Now the idea would be, what is interesting for the community? But if there is some flow or some feature in there that is deemed not useful enough, you can definitely leave it out. Back to your first objection. So third-party libraries, you do have some. Yeah, Nimbus is probably the best one, but they give you the easy parts. Like, they give you token requests, token responses, that kind of thing, and it's so easy to create your own. But they don't give you, for example, the engine that actually keeps your token fresh, right? This is still up to you to write, and that's the hard part, because that's the asynchronous part. There's that, and you wouldn't find in third-party libraries things that we included in our manager, like the ability in token exchange to actually dynamically fetch also the actor and subject tokens. So basically, you can keep all these tokens fresh, and the auth manager does everything for you. I don't know of any library that is capable of doing that. And that's very useful, actually. We have users that really enjoy doing that. Right, maybe?
Yeah, I agree with Dan's point here, which is, like, I don't actually have an opinion on what flows should be included, what needs to be done. What scares me is, it sounds like, there's a lot of history here for, a lot of decisions that were made, completely externally to the project, and that's great. That we want people to be able to plug those things in. But when we're talking about putting these things in the project by, to make it easy to distribute, and putting these things in the project to make them, hopefully the default, I think we need to figure out what is the right balance of functionality and maintenance for Iceberg, the project, which I think is larger than just how do we get this reviewed. So it's great to break this down into PRs, but I think the step back that Dan's suggesting is a good one. What do we want to do in the project, and how do we want that to be exposed? Because I think ideally the project will have only one auth manager that can make these use cases, and let's get this in and extend it, but have a opinion about what we need to add, what order do we add it, and also does this fit with the core of what Iceberg does, or should we rely on a third-party library for certain portions of it to avoid exposing ourselves to a lot of CVEs because we're re-implementing something that is security related. So more questions than answers from me this time. but I think it is good to consider what is right for the project here.
Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. As an end user, I like the flexibility of picking and choosing what implementations. For something like security, I understand, you might not want to do that for security reasons. I think before we add it to the repo, or there's two things here, right? One is adding it to the repo, and another is making it default, the default security manager. I think before the second one, where the Iceberg project itself pretty much endorses this code and everything underneath. I'd like to see some like stats and usage and all of that, right? Like I would want to see that this is generally adopted by other people who are using Iceberg clients or engines outside of the community. I think those are kind of nice metrics to have to say, okay, this is like something adopted. Iceberg, the Iceberg project itself can then use those data points to like figure out, whether or not we want it to be the default. I think the second point I wanted to make is that I'm working on some of the file IO stuff that we have internally in Iceberg. So S3 file IO, ADLS. And I feel like a lot of those things are easier to work with when it's a little decoupled from the primary project itself. And what I mean is, for example, we ship these file IOs with each release of Iceberg. If I want it to be backwards compatible, like I can't go back to 1.6 and add a feature to it, right? So I'm trying to figure out if there's a path where maybe we can do like an extension, right? And maybe it's already there. I know it's pluggable, but having maybe a file IO implementation that is by the community, that is optional, that people can pull in, part of Apache, part of Iceberg, as an extension kind of ecosystem. I think I want to talk a little bit about that if we have the time.
So about the metrics, very good idea. I'll try to gather some metrics, definitely. And then about the where to host the code, I'm not opposed at all to a separate repository. I mean, we need to weigh the pros and cons, but like I said, there's the inclusion in Spark runtime. There is also the fact that the release cadence will be different. So people will start asking which version of the Host Manager works with version of the Spark runtime, that kind of thing. But I mean, we can have a matrix somewhere and then the problem is solved. But yeah, like I said, I'm not opposed at all to that approach. Laurent?
Yes, just going back to Daniel and Ryan comments on like using like a command library and then you comment on like, oh, like there's so many features. Like, is there like a common ground of using like one of these general library at least to get like the basic OAuth support, and then like adding the specific refresh on top of? Like, I kind of really like, I mean, even if that's OAuth spec is well defined and like it seems relatively easy to implement, like having like something like a good library and like which tracks that regularly is probably like the best. And I think that's, I guess I have the same concern about the current implementation of OAuth in Iceberg. It's not something we are giving a lot of thought like as it's today. So like, I mean, I'm also in favor of like even like for the existing OAuth implementation in Iceberg, actually like to start discussing maybe replacing you like something things. Although I know that like some peculiarities, but yeah, I'm just I would like maybe like, I mean, I would pretty favor an hybrid approach. Like Nimbus in Java world seems to be like really the one tracking the most closely the specs and be the most up to date. Google OAuth library is really focused on what Google actually supports, which is a good chunk, but like not necessarily like extend a lot about like discovery or like external token scenario, external token exchange scenario. For other languages, I honestly no idea, but.
If I
Talat?
speak on behalf of the Google, definitely we support this library because current Iceberg auth, the system is not supporting our refresh token things, and any service use the Google with Iceberg, the customer has to update the token every 1 hour by just killing this workshop and start again, which is very bad experience. That's why I implement the Google Auth Manager. I was suggesting when I initially talk, I was suggesting that make this library is kind of detached from the Iceberg and make it an Apache project. Then the Iceberg can introduce some like extended auths or manager maybe. Then this library can be direct dependency. This will address the Alex, the metrics thing, like which version of the Iceberg, which version of the library. It doesn't require. I believe you, Alex, you did a really good job for the covering the general use cases, which used by all of the auth users. And it's very clean library, to just use one dependency as if I remember correctly.
Yes, exactly. That's Alt0, yeah, for passing JWTs.
If I may ask you, Talat, like, do you know, like, I mean, if you were to suppose like a general purpose OAuth library, like, is there like things which like will not be supported by Google? I guess that's the question of like if we are saying we want like to really improve the OAuth situations, but like the current Iceberg OAuth manager doesn't support some of the flows that Google needs, like, but like more generic one would support that. Like, would you be okay with that?
I didn't get the question, Laurent.
I
Sorry.
mean, right now it seems like you say you are using the Google library because like the Iceberg OAuth manager, the current one, doesn't support like flows supported by Google.
Right. Yes.
But like if you were to like, would Alex OAuth manager would be enough like to support Google, I guess.
I think Google has two, right? Because there's the ones that are part of the GCP API.
Yeah, and which is also less deprecated, so it's kind of weird, but yeah.
It's in maintenance mode, and I think that's largely because there hasn't been like radical changes or new asks.
I mean, the question is like OAuth is OAuth, like it's a spec, and so like I wonder like is like Google actually deviating from the spec? From my understanding, my own work, separate work, like it doesn't. So that's why I'm saying like, do we need like to a second question as well. No, I forgot. I guess, oh yeah, the separate project. Isn't that like hyper specific to Iceberg though? Because like it's basically like an Iceberg OAuth manager we are discussing. So is that like is like a good idea to have like a Apache project, which is basically like an Iceberg OAuth project, or like should just be like a sub project of Iceberg and like maybe? Yeah.
No, you can make that project is separate auth project, and the Iceberg manager side is just a one interface you implemented and call the rest of the flows.
But I'm not sure we want to create like a new OAuth library because there's already like existing ones. What we are trying to do, I guess, was like the original goal was to create like a richer OAuth integration inside the Iceberg community. So that's why I'm saying like the Iceberg, the other project, Apache project, the question is like, is kind of loaded. I'm not sure, I want to answer that without understanding the goals for the Iceberg project.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of questions here. Let me try and throw out some preliminary opinions or potential answers to them. One is, where should this code live, right? Do we want an OAuth manager in Iceberg? I think that's a good question. In some ways, your OAuth manager maybe should be related to the catalog, right? So there's an argument for doing this independently. There's an argument for doing this in Polaris. There's an argument for doing this in Iceberg. I think I agree with the contribution going to Iceberg because we want essentially a baseline of OAuth support that works the same way across catalogs. so that you don't get, you've got to have an OAuth plugin for Databricks and you've got to have an OAuth plugin for Google, and like just wildly different behaviors, flows, and things like that. We want the Iceberg library, when using OAuth, to be able to support certain features. And I think those are features of the client library, and therefore having a manager that's, an auth manager specifically for OAuth in the client library is probably the right direction. Then there's the question of how many of those do we want? And I think we probably all agree that we should have one, because you have the same problem if you have, the default OAuth manager and the more feature-rich OAuth manager, right? Like you're maintaining two code paths. So we should figure out, what flows do we need to support? What does OAuth in this client look like? And have, I think, one implementation there. Does anyone disagree with the logic of either of those questions? Fantastic. Okay, so at that point, we're talking about, well, do we want to have this as a separate module or not? Or do we want to, let's look into the dependencies. I appreciate the arguments here saying, like, we tried to minimize dependencies. That's always good. And, the OAuth libraries that are out there didn't actually buy us a lot of the functionality that we wanted, but we could, go and add one. Those seem like reasonable arguments to me. So that sounds good. The next thing is just, what functionality do we want in this thing? And that, I think, should probably be our focus. Because the original auth manager was, we wanted so limited functionality that we didn't think it was a great time to make a lot of decisions about dependencies and things like that. We literally wanted a credential to token exchange and like a delegation token exchange, and that was basically it. Now we're getting to the level of complexity where I think we definitely need to revisit those decisions. But to do that, we really need to determine what are the flows that we need to support. How do we accomplish this? I think one thing that we all know we need to support is refresh tokens and token exchange. So, maybe just prioritizing getting refresh tokens into the OAuth manager, and deciding, can we extend the current OAuth manager with this functionality, or do we need to fully replace the existing OAuth manager? Those seem like tractable questions, and we can move on from, starting small and moving forward. I know someone who has also been very quiet here, suspiciously quiet, is Christian, because I know he has an entire doc on OAuth flows that Iceberg REST clients should support. And so I'm curious what he is thinking about all of this as well.
Yeah, sorry, I'm traveling. That's why I was a bit quiet probably today, and also don't have my camera on. But so my take on this is that this is something that we should standardize, and the way that especially token exchange is currently implemented in the Iceberg project is not working well with some of the implementations, ODP implementations out there. So yeah, we're a little bit over time. Not sure if you want to continue this today or next time. But yeah,
it's your thought. And
yeah, so my take on this is that probably we won't be able to extend the existing auth manager in a way to support everything that we wanted to support, simply because it behaves differently. So we will need a switch somewhere. Like the proposed auth manager is, as it is proposed, is flexible enough to connect to most implementations out there that I've tested. So from different hyperscalers, different implementations, on how token exchange even works. I think token exchange is by far the flow that we need to discuss most, because I think the other flows are pretty well standardized. There's always the question, like which security mechanism you use, PKC or not, something along those lines. But those are minor details compared to how token exchange works, especially as some mechanisms that we do want to cope with token exchange, such as downscoping, for example, isn't implemented even by the largest IDPs out there, for example, Entra ID. Yeah, so my baseline is I think Iceberg should support this out of the box, because I think having a secure default is absolutely valuable. And we have seen already that folks start using what is out there. We already have authentication flows as part of the Iceberg projects, and those are not suitable for humans, but people use them for humans and thus reduce security out there. So this is why I'm saying that I think this is super valuable to have as part of the Iceberg project in the end. But yeah, I can't really judge if this should be part of the core code base or a separate project that we just integrate into the binary. I'm just saying that they should be very, very easy to use, in my opinion, because security comes first. Yeah. So I guess this is my stand on this.
Yeah, I
Thanks,
think my
Christian.
takeaway is it sounds like everybody kind of agrees that we want one solution. We want it to support the most standard and be the most broadly usable. We are falling short of that today. I think the big questions are really just like, what is the extent of what we want to support? There's lots of things that people may ask for and weird, flows or other things. Like, do we want to try and take on all of that? Do we want to take on just the standard ones and then say, hey, go extend and build and use your own if you're, looking for, what was the one Lauren posted, proof of possession, like I don't know what that is. So there may be some balance that we need to make in order to figure out like what is the right scope for the project to take on and not end up becoming an OAuth project, right? And then I think we just need to figure out what is the right balance between like what do we introduce in the project, what do we rely on externally? Is that everything external and you pull it in the fat jars? Is it some combination of like leveraging libraries for some of the standard components and then we're integrating and building on top of it? Or do we just roll our own? So I think these are all still kind of open questions that we need to work through. But I think we should start with what do we want to support? Like what are the flows that we think are standard enough that we need to support? What is generally acceptable? What do we want to deprecate over time of the current implementation? Those are the things that I think we need to settle initially.
Yeah, thanks both of you for your valuable comments. So your comments will be recorded. So I believe Ryan and others drop the meeting can also still see them later. So since we are over time, I will call this to be the end of today. We will see you 3 weeks later. I will upload the recording shortly.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.